The Niagara Promise. The morning sun stretched across the prairie as Henry tightened the straps on the back of the Ford F-150. The old truck had carried them faithfully through the Rockies and all the way to Banff, and now it was pointed east, toward a place Henry and Margaret had dreamed of seeing since they were young: Niagara Falls. Buddy, their golden retriever, wagged his tail furiously as if sensing another adventure. He jumped into the back seat, head immediately out the window, ears flapping in the cool breeze. Henry chuckled. "I swear, that dog enjoys the road more than either of us." Margaret smiled as she slid into the passenger seat, a thermos of coffee balanced in her hands. "Well, he doesn't have to worry about directions or traffic," she said. "He just enjoys the ride." The Ford rumbled onto the highway, leaving behind the mountains that had sheltered them for days. Ahead stretched the long ribbon of road that would eventually lead them to the thundering waters of Niagara. The long drive. The cab filled with the soft crackle of an oldies station Henry found on the radio. The familiar chords of the Beatles' "Here Comes the Sun" floated through the speakers. Henry tapped the steering wheel in rhythm. "You know," he said, "I remember sitting in my parents' living room in the 60s, hearing this for the first time, thought it was written just for me." Margaret laughed, her voice light and warm. "And now, 60 years later, it still fits, doesn't it?" He nodded, eyes fixed on the horizon. "Yeah, new day, new start. Feels like that's been the theme of our whole trip." The scenery changed gradually as they crossed from Alberta into the flat farmlands of Saskatchewan. Golden wheat fields stretched for miles, broken only by the occasional red barn or a cluster of silos. Margaret leaned against the window, taking it all in. "It's funny," she said softly, "how each place has its own personality. Banff felt like a fairy tale. Here it feels honest, solid, like the heartbeat of Canada." Henry glanced at her, his eyes crinkling. "You're getting poetic on me again." "Well," she replied with a grin, "travel does that to me. Maybe it's the road, or maybe it's just being with you." Rest stops and roadside charm. By late afternoon, they pulled into a roadside diner with a neon sign that buzzed faintly in the daylight: Maple Leaf Cafe. The parking lot was lined with trucks and sedans, and the smell of frying bacon and fresh coffee drifted out as they stepped inside. A waitress with a cheerful smile greeted them with, "Sit anywhere you like, hon." They chose a booth by the window. Buddy settled under the table, content to nap while his humans ate. The diner was a slice of North American charm: red vinyl seats, chrome trim, and a jukebox in the corner playing CCR's Bad Moon Rising. Henry ordered a stack of pancakes, while Margaret went for a grilled cheese with tomato soup. As they ate, they chatted about the road ahead. "So tomorrow," Margaret said between bites, "we'll be close enough to stop for the night before we hit Niagara. That way, we'll be rested." "Good plan," Henry agreed. "Can't have us stumbling into one of the natural wonders of the world half asleep." Margaret laughed. "You make it sound like we're meeting royalty." Henry leaned back, sipping his coffee. "In a way, we are. I mean, think about it. People travel thousands of miles just to see those falls. For us, it's been a dream since, our 20s? "Earlier," she corrected. "I remember us talking about it when we were still dating. You promised me once that someday you'd take me there." Henry paused, surprised. "Did I?" She nodded, her eyes sparkling. "You probably forgot, but I didn't." For a moment, Henry couldn't speak. He reached across the table and took her hand, squeezing it gently. "Well, looks like I'm finally keeping that promise." Evening reflections. Back on the road, the sun dipped low, painting the sky in streaks of orange and pink. Buddy's head rested on Margaret's lap as she absent-mindedly stroked his fur. Henry cleared his throat. "You ever think about how different things would have been if we'd gone earlier in life? Back when we were young?" Margaret looked thoughtful. "Maybe, but I don't regret it. Back then we were too busy with jobs, bills, raising kids. Now we have time, and maybe, just maybe, we appreciate it more." Henry smiled. "Leave it to you to find the silver lining." They stopped for the night at a small roadside motel just outside Thunder Bay. The neon sign flickered vacancy as they parked the Ford beneath a buzzing street lamp. The room smelled faintly of pine cleaner, with floral bedspreads that had seen better days, but it was clean and quiet. After dinner at a nearby diner, meatloaf and mashed potatoes for Henry, a garden salad and slice of pie for Margaret, they returned to the motel. Henry sat on the edge of the bed, unlacing his boots, while Margaret flipped through a tourist brochure she'd picked up. "Tomorrow," she said with a smile, "Niagara." Henry nodded, feeling a strange mix of nerves and excitement. He lay back on the pillow, staring at the ceiling fan. In the quiet, he whispered, "I can't believe it's finally happening." Beside him, Margaret reached for his hand. "Believe it," she said softly, "because tomorrow we'll stand there together." Buddy let out a contented sigh from his spot on the floor, as if agreeing. Closing scene, part 1. Outside, the night settled in. The hum of passing trucks on the highway was the lullaby of the road. Tomorrow, Niagara awaited them, a place of power, beauty, and long-held promises. For now, though, Henry, Margaret, and Buddy drifted into sleep, dreaming of water, light, and the adventure that lay just beyond the horizon. Morning came with a crisp breeze drifting off the river, and the Ford's windshield was speckled with dew. Henry was the first to stir, pulling on his flannel shirt and stepping outside to breathe in the damp air of Ontario. Margaret soon followed, brushing her hair back with her hand, a light smile playing on her face. "Today's the day," she said, her voice carrying a mix of excitement and disbelief. Buddy wagged his tail, circling them eagerly, as if he too knew that something extraordinary was about to happen. The drive into Niagara Falls was shorter than Henry expected. One moment they were rolling past quiet neighborhoods, and the next the skyline rose before them, hotels towering with glass windows that caught the morning light. Margaret leaned forward in her seat, eyes wide, as she caught the first glimpse of the mist rising into the sky. "There it is," she whispered, almost reverently. "Do you see it?" Henry nodded, his throat tight. He'd seen pictures his entire life, postcards, travel shows, old magazine clippings, but none of them came close to the real thing. The plume of mist rose like a ghost, drifting above the tree line, marking the place where the water thundered into the gorge. They parked near Clifton Hill, where the town was already buzzing with early visitors. Neon signs advertised arcades, wax museums, and souvenir shops. The smell of fried dough and fresh coffee hung in the air. Margaret laughed at the carnival-like atmosphere. "Not quite what I imagined," she said. "Yeah," Henry agreed, adjusting his cap. "But I bet once we get close, it'll feel different." At the visitor center, they purchased the adventure pass, the young clerk behind the counter explaining in a friendly voice how to plan their day. "Make sure you leave 2 hours for Journey Behind the Falls," she advised. "And you'll want to catch Niagara's Fury after that. But first, you don't want to miss the Hornblower." So they made their way down to the dock. The crowd buzzed with chatter in half a dozen languages, cameras flashing as families, couples, and tour groups lined up for the boat. Buddy stayed behind at a shaded rest area with other pets. Margaret gave him a reassuring pat before they boarded. Henry held Margaret's hand as they stepped onto the Hornblower, the deck vibrating beneath their feet. The boat pulled away from the dock, cutting through the current. At first, it was just a pleasant ride, the skyline of the city behind them, the river calm and wide. But as they drew closer, the roar grew louder, the mist thicker. Soon, droplets clung to their clothes, their faces, their hair. Margaret laughed, her voice lost in the thunder. "Oh, Henry, look at it!" They were surrounded by walls of water, the Horseshoe Falls towering ahead, the American Falls crashing to their left. The sound was unlike anything Henry had ever heard, an endless rolling thunder that shook the air itself. He lifted his face to the spray, eyes stinging, heart racing like he was 20 years old again. Margaret clutched his arm, her eyes shining as if the falls had poured life straight into her veins. For a moment, time itself seemed to stop. When they stepped back onto dry land, they were soaked but exhilarated. Margaret's hair clung to her cheeks, her sweater heavy with water, but she only laughed, radiant. "Worth every drop," she said breathlessly. Henry could only nod, unable to put into words what he felt. Their next stop was Journey Behind the Falls. The tunnels were damp and echoed with the steady rumble of the water above. They walked slowly, hand in hand, their footsteps crunching on wet stone. At the viewing portals, they pressed close to the railing, peering out at the sheets of water plummeting just feet away. It was like staring into the veins of the earth, raw power cascading endlessly. Margaret whispered, "Can you imagine? All that force, all that beauty, every single day." Henry squeezed her hand, his chest tightening with awe. From there, they moved on to Niagara's Fury, a short film and experience that recreated the geological story of the falls. Margaret clung to his arm during the shaking platforms and misty sprays, laughing like a girl. Henry found himself laughing too, swept up in her delight. By late afternoon, hunger gnawed at them. They made their way to Element on the Falls, a sleek restaurant perched with a view of the cascading water. From their table by the window, they could see the mist rising, the light shifting as the sun dipped lower in the sky. Over plates of grilled salmon and roasted vegetables, they talked quietly, their voices almost lost to the view before them. "Do you ever think," Margaret asked, sipping her wine, "that maybe we waited for this moment on purpose? That maybe we weren't supposed to see it until now?" Henry looked at her, the woman he had known for decades, and felt something stir deep inside him. "Maybe so," he said. "I think maybe we wouldn't have understood it back then. But now it feels like it was waiting for us." After dinner, they strolled to Queen Victoria Park. The gardens were lush and carefully kept, bright flowers swaying gently in the evening air. Families wandered along the paths, children pointing toward the illuminated mist above the gorge. Margaret slipped her arm through Henry's, resting her head lightly on his shoulder. Buddy rejoined them, tail wagging, happy to trot alongside as if he'd been part of every moment. As twilight deepened, the falls lit up in brilliant colors, reds and blues dancing across the rushing water. Crowds gathered along the railings, cameras flashing, but Henry and Margaret stood a little apart, content simply to take it in. The sound of the water rolled over them, powerful yet calming, a lullaby written in thunder. When they finally returned to their hotel that night, exhausted but filled with an energy neither could quite explain, Henry paused before unlocking the door. He glanced at Margaret, her cheeks flushed, her eyes still bright from the day's adventures. "You know," he said softly, "I think I finally get it. Why people come here, why they call it one of the wonders. It's not just the falls, it's what it does to you inside." Margaret smiled, slipping her hand into his. "Then let's never forget this feeling." Buddy curled up at the foot of the bed as they climbed beneath the blankets. Outside, the steady roar of Niagara was still faintly audible, a reminder that the world was vast, alive, and waiting for them to keep discovering. The next morning broke earlier than Henry expected. The curtains in their hotel room glowed faintly with the first light, and outside, the muffled roar of the falls was ever present, as if the world itself were breathing steadily through stone and water. Buddy stirred at the foot of the bed, stretching with a yawn before padding over to nuzzle Henry's hand. Margaret was already awake, sitting by the window in her robe, gazing out at the mist rising in the distance. "Couldn't sleep?" Henry asked, his voice husky. Margaret turned, smiling softly. "I didn't want to. I wanted to see the falls at sunrise." She gestured to the horizon, where the sky was turning shades of lavender and gold. "It feels like they never rest, like they're alive." Henry pulled on his jeans and flannel, poured them both coffee from the little in-room machine, and joined her at the window. Together they watched as the first rays of sunlight caught the spray, painting the water in fleeting rainbows. After a hearty breakfast downstairs, pancakes for Margaret, bacon and eggs for Henry, they set out for their second day of adventure. The town was quieter in the early hours, the crowds not yet spilling onto the sidewalks. They drove the Ford a short way, Buddy leaning out the window with his ears flapping in the cool morning air. Their first stop was the famed Whirlpool State Park. A short trail led them to an overlook where the river swirled violently in a vast emerald whirlpool. The sound was different from the falls, less thunderous, more urgent, a rushing, twisting roar that made Henry's chest tighten. Margaret held onto the railing, her hair whipping in the wind. "It's like the river is fighting itself," she murmured. Buddy barked once, tail wagging furiously, as if sensing the raw energy below. Henry glanced at him and chuckled. "I think he wants to dive in." They walked the trail together, their steps crunching on the gravel path, the scent of pine and damp earth surrounding them. The air felt cooler here, charged, like the world was reminding them of its strength. From there, they drove further south, crossing the bridge to Goat Island. The closer they came to the falls, the more the mist thickened, dampening their hair and skin. They made their way to the entrance of the Cave of the Winds, where yellow ponchos and sandals were handed out with a smile by the staff. Margaret laughed as she tugged the bright plastic over her clothes. "We're going to look ridiculous," she said, but her eyes sparkled with anticipation. Descending the wooden steps into the gorge, they were immediately engulfed by the roar. Water crashed just feet away, pounding against the rocks with ferocity. The wooden platform shook beneath their feet, slick with spray. Margaret clutched Henry's hand as they edged closer to the famed hurricane deck. And then it hit them. The full force of the Bridal Veil Falls, slamming down with a fury that drenched them instantly. The wind whipped, the spray stung, and laughter erupted from Margaret's lips. Henry threw his head back and let the water pummel his face, his arms spread wide as if daring the falls to test him. Buddy waited patiently above with a handler, safe from the chaos, but Henry could almost imagine the dog barking encouragement from afar. When they finally climbed back up, their ponchos plastered to their bodies, they looked at each other and burst out laughing, soaked to the bone but alive in every sense. "Now that," Henry said, catching his breath, "was worth the trip alone." By midday, they dried off and grabbed a quick bite at the Misty Dog Grill, a no-frills spot near the park. Hot dogs, fries, and milkshakes never tasted so good. Margaret dabbed mustard from her lip with a napkin, smiling at Henry. "You know, for all the fancy meals we've had, this one feels just right." In the afternoon, they crossed over to Luna Island, a small patch of land tucked between the American Falls and Bridal Veil Falls. From the railing, they could see the water rush past just feet away, a torrent of white and green hurling itself into the void. Margaret leaned forward, awestruck. "It's like standing at the edge of forever." Henry slipped his arm around her shoulders. "Forever doesn't look half bad with you here." She blushed, resting her head against his chest as the mist wrapped them like a veil. Later, they returned to their hotel to freshen up before their final adventure of the day. As twilight fell, they made their way to the Skyline Tower, its slender form rising above the skyline. The elevator shot upward, glass walls revealing the falls bathed in the soft glow of dusk. At the top, they stepped onto the observation deck just as the sun slipped below the horizon. The sky ignited in colors of fire, reds, oranges, purples, reflected in the mist and the river below. The falls glowed under spotlights, cascading like liquid silver. Henry reached for Margaret's hand, squeezing it gently. "You ever think we'd be here? At this point in our lives?" Margaret's eyes shimmered with tears she didn't bother to hide. "Not in a million years, but I can't imagine it any other way." They stood there in silence, the world vast and endless before them. Around them, tourists pointed and snapped photos, but Henry and Margaret barely noticed. It felt like the universe had carved out this moment just for them. By the time they descended and walked back to their hotel, the streets glowed with neon, laughter spilling from bars and cafes. They were tired, yes, but it was the kind of exhaustion that came from living fully. Buddy patted happily at their side, tail wagging, the ever-faithful companion who seemed to understand that something had shifted for his humans these past days. In their room, Henry pulled the curtains back one last time, watching the mist drift upward into the night sky. Margaret came up behind him, wrapping her arms around his waist. "Tomorrow," she whispered, "we say goodbye." Henry nodded slowly, feeling the weight of the words, but also the promise they carried. Tomorrow, they would leave Niagara, but the falls would stay with them. The sound, the spray, the feeling of being small in the face of something eternal, yet renewed. As they lay down to sleep, the steady thunder outside was no longer just noise. It was a heartbeat, echoing within them, urging them forward into whatever awaited next. The morning of their departure came quietly. The city outside was already waking, buses humming down the street, tourists with cameras gathering along the sidewalks, but inside the hotel room, Henry and Margaret moved slowly, savoring each moment. Buddy sat by the door, tail thumping the carpet as if urging them on. Margaret zipped up her bag and glanced at Henry, who was staring out the window one last time. Mist rose above the Horseshoe Falls, tinted pink by the early sun. He sighed softly. "Hard to leave something like this behind," he murmured. She walked over, slipping her arm through his. "We're not leaving it behind," she said. "It's coming with us. Every sound, every drop of spray, it's in us now." Henry smiled at that, leaning to kiss the top of her head. You always know how to put it. They checked out of the hotel and loaded their bags into the back of the Ford. The old truck gleamed faintly in the morning light, ready to carry them onward. As Henry slid into the driver's seat, he gave the dash a gentle pat. "Well, old friend, time to roll again." Buddy barked as if in agreement, scrambling happily into the back seat. Driving out of town, they passed familiar sights: Clifton Hill with its noisy arcades, the quiet stretch of Queen Victoria Park, and the viewing platforms already filling with eager visitors. Margaret waved once through the window, not to anyone in particular, but to the falls themselves, as if saying goodbye to a friend. On the Rainbow Bridge, the view opened wide, the gorge yawning beneath them, the river rushing on, unbothered by boarders or travelers. For a few silent minutes, Henry and Margaret simply watched the water flow, each lost in their own thoughts. Once across, Henry steered the Ford onto the highway, the tires humming steadily beneath them. Margaret unfolded a brochure she had picked up in the hotel lobby the night before. The glossy paper caught the light, showing pictures of another wonder, Niagara Falls in miniature compared to where they were heading next. She tapped the image with her finger. Niagara was the promise, but Henry? The next stop? The dream. Niagara was just the beginning. He glanced over at her, eyebrow raised. "You're talking about Niagara on the lake?" She shook her head, eyes gleaming. "No, I'm talking about the fall's bigger cousin, the one we've always wanted to see together." She paused for effect. "Niagara was our promise, but Niagara leads us east to Niagara's shadow, to the great falls of the world, to the road that ends at—" Henry chuckled, cutting her off. "Niagara to Niagara, huh? Sounds like you're planning a whole series." Margaret laughed, folding the brochure and tucking it into her bag. "Maybe I am, but let's just say this: Niagara reminded us we're not done. And wherever we're going next, I want it to feel just as alive as this." The Ford rumbled on, the road stretching wide and open ahead. Behind them, the roar of Niagara faded into memory, but inside, its thunder remained. For Henry and Margaret, this was no ending. It was a beginning, a bridge to the adventures still waiting just over the horizon. Buddy settled between them, his head resting on Margaret's lap, eyes half closed in perfect contentment. She stroked his fur, her gaze fixed on the endless road ahead. "Next stop," she whispered, almost to herself, "Niagara's promise and beyond." Henry tightened his grip on the wheel, the corners of his mouth turning upward. "Then let's chase it, Maggie. Let's chase it all the way." And with that, the Ford carried them onward, leaving behind the mist and thunder of the falls, carrying them into the quiet unknown where the sound of water still echoed in their hearts. If you enjoyed this story, hit that like button and subscribe.